And so what I want to say to people right now, what is so important to me to say, is that trauma is not a failure of optimism. Trauma is not a failure of your strength. Trauma does not mean you don't love your baby. Trauma does not mean that you need to be more grateful. Trauma is a central nervous system response.
Hi everybody, so it is Elizabeth, also known as Nurse Sabe, here on YouTube and Instagram, back again with another video for you guys. And this video is one that is so important that I really want to make sure that all of you birthing people and support people watch, and it is about birth trauma. So I took a class recently about birth trauma, and I've had lots of questions on if I could cover birth trauma, and I did not feel that I had the expertise to do so. I'm still learning and I'm still growing in my practice to help prevent birth trauma. One way that I have done so is by taking a class on birth trauma prevention from Krysta Dancy. And so I reached out to her to see if she would be willing to collaborate on a video with me, and she did just that. So I have our Zoom meeting that I recorded for you guys. I really encourage you to listen to the whole thing. She's going to go over what is birth trauma, what can we do going into birth to help reduce the risk of birth trauma, what puts us at a higher risk for having birth trauma that we can kind of watch out for, and then what we could do if we've experienced birth trauma and what a loved one can do if we have experienced birth trauma to help us work through that trauma. She also talks a little bit about COVID-19 and birth trauma in relation to that and what we know and the evolving research. She is highly evidence-based. She is a wonderful educator, and she is also a marriage and family therapist and a certified birth doula. So she has come at this from many different angles. She has a ton of beautiful and wonderful resources for you guys. I'm going to leave them all linked down below. So this is one that if you just want to pop in some headphones and listen to more like a podcast, I think that's super appropriate. There aren't any pictures or visuals to go along with this video. I also just want to mention, I'm sorry my personal audio is a little off. I've tried to fix that the best I can in editing, but I've cut out a lot of me talking, so you're mostly just going to hear from our expert here. Definitely let me know if you guys found this video helpful. I would love to have more experts on my channel because there's so much to childbirth that I am not the expert on. So I would love to bring more experts in and help you guys out. Thank you guys so much for watching in advance, and definitely check out some of the links and resources linked down below if you have any further questions.
My name is Krysta Dancy. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist and a certified birth doula. My specialty is in trauma and birth. I'm also a provider educator on the subject of birth trauma prevention and for mental health providers on birth trauma treatment. You can find more about my courses and also my online support groups for moms and families at birthandtraumasupportcenter.org.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being here with us today, Krysta. And I think first and foremost, we really need to define what is birth trauma. So if you want to go ahead and do that for us.
Yeah, so what we know from the research is that depending upon how you define it, birth trauma impacts between 8% and over 30% of those who give birth. The way that I like to talk about it is I like to make a comparison. So if I can make a comparison between normal memory and traumatic memory, I think that might help viewers figure out where they fall. So in a normal memory, if you go out for a delicious dinner, what's going to happen is at the beginning, the memory is going to have every single detail. You're going to remember every smell, every sizzle, every sound, the music, the meal, the server. But over time and pretty quickly, the memory starts to become factual. You don't have as many of the bodily sensations connected to it. It's not as vivid. And that's normal memory. That's what we want to have happen when something big happens, is that over time it starts to become a fact. I remember that happened. I remember that happened to me, but it doesn't bring up this overwhelming tidal wave of sensation or emotion. It just becomes factual. A traumatic memory, for a variety of reasons, is different. And what ends up happening instead is your memory formation it maintains that vivid nature. And more importantly, it maintains that nature of having an impact on your body and your emotions. So it doesn't matter how much time passes, the memory doesn't fade into factual, it stays vivid in the body. It continues to have that reaction and response. So when a woman has a traumatic birth, what we're really talking about is any variation of that, where despite the passage of time, every time she thinks about it, she goes into flashback, it overwhelms her body, she overwhelms her emotions. She finds herself having what we would call like a fight or flight response to it, particularly when it's like triggered by sensation memories. So it's like smells, sights, sounds. So any variation of that, it can be from what we see depicted in like the media as like a really clear flashback where all of a sudden you are reliving it fully, but it can also sort of look like anxiety or depression where they just seem to not be able to stop thinking about it. It keeps playing on repeat when something triggers the memory. And so over time, we start to see them avoid things that trigger the memory, avoid talking about it because it's distressing. And so that can look like it's getting better, but what really distinguishes trauma is that if something triggers it, it doesn't get better with time. It maintains that same strong, overwhelming reaction. And what we know is if we define trauma that way, it actually is happening in over 30% of women who are giving birth.
Wow, that is crazy.
Yeah.
Think about 30% of women. And so what would make a woman going into birth perhaps more likely to experience birth trauma? Is there anything in her past medical history or past psychological history that could affect that?
Yeah, so we have some correlations, and I want to tell people here, if you're on your way to giving birth and you fit into these categories, it's not a prediction. It doesn't mean you're going to have trauma, right? This is just a correlation. When we look at people who develop birth trauma, what are some characteristics that they have in common? But that's not the same thing as saying if you have these characteristics, you're going to get birth trauma. So I want to say that to anybody who's pregnant now and is going, oh my gosh, she's talking about me. This isn't a prediction. I don't have a crystal ball. But there are things that correlate to higher risk factors. So that could be if you are a survivor of sexual assault. That could be if you had a previously traumatic birth that can be triggered in the upcoming birth. Some other factors that might influence it are factors related to providers and the birth itself. Like if you feel confused about what's happening to you and why, if you feel a sense of shock over what's happening because it's overwhelming your nervous system. If you feel that your providers or the environment you were in, that you didn't have a voice or you didn't have influence over what was happening, so there's a sense of powerlessness, that can increase the risk of birth trauma. And then, you know, interestingly, one of the things I always like to share, because I think it sort of flies in the face of what people expect about this, we have found that people who are less prepared for birth are more likely to have birth trauma. And so I like to say that because sometimes what we start to think is, oh, these are people who have really high expectations or rigid expectations, and those are the ones who are going to end up having birth trauma because they've put so much into this. But what the literature actually shows is the more you've prepared for birth, the less likely you are to have a traumatic birth. So I think that's really interesting and worth saying because it gives people an option.
I really like knowing that because I feel like then there's something that we can do maybe to kind of arm ourselves against birth trauma. I don't know if you want to speak, what things can women do before going in to have their babies, maybe even before pregnancy, to help reduce the risk of experiencing birth trauma?
Yeah. So the first one, obviously, I've already mentioned, which is preparing. And what preparing counts as is any childbirth education classes, any books that you read, any podcasts that you listen to. So people watching your video right now, they're technically preparing for birth according to the literature. Big believer in that, because if you don't understand the language that's being spoken around you, it gives you less power and less influence. You're more likely to feel confused about what's happening. You're more likely to feel shocked about what's happening if you aren't prepared for it. And we know that shock primes the central nervous system to have that trauma response. So there's that. I'm a big believer in doulas and the role that doulas play in trauma prevention. What we know is that part of where communication difficulties lie, emotional hardship lies, is like sort of in the modern system, in the way that birth is really not set up for the birthing family to have wraparound, complete, holistic care. That's just not an option that most providers have to give. They have a lot of people they're supposed to keep safe and take care of. Nurses have a lot of charting and a lot of patients. And so doulas are this beautiful buffer because not only are they a part of preparation, because prenatally you're doing preparation, but in the room, they're there to help fill in those gaps. And then what's really valuable, according to the literature, is the opportunity to debrief after the experience, because there's this time period where your brain's trying to make sense of what happened, even if it was a positive birth. Your brain is still trying to make sense of what happened for several weeks after. And so having a person who is there through the whole thing that can be a part of that dialogue can actually decrease the risk of it becoming a traumatic memory. Because questions, holes, they get filled, you start to have understanding, and that can actually help your brain make sense of the experience, not making it either good or bad experience, but making it a memory that your brain can process as non-traumatic. I still think there's value in birth doulas, even if they have to support you virtually. So I still think, even though unfortunately they may or may not be there physically, having that continuous care is still super valuable. And their support partner can learn to do things like counter pressure, right? The doula can be like, no, press there. It's totally workable from that angle. But yeah, I still think there's a lot of value in preventing trauma. So the other one that I recommend is, it's really important to do your due diligence. What we see in the research is, even providers are super important, but because again, the way that modern obstetrics works, you often don't see your preferred provider at your birth. So that's not something that you have always a lot of control over. It is, the research says the greatest predictor of how your birth is going to go is actually the facility. Nurses have such a huge role in how that goes. And so if you have the ability, which a lot of people don't have options, but if you have the ability to do your homework, to look at statistics, to find a facility, asking other people who've given birth, asking local birth workers, asking local doulas, like what they recommend, if you do that research, that can be something in your favor. It's not a guarantee. And I think that that's what's hard about it, is you could do all this and it doesn't guarantee you anything, but those help decrease the risk of that becoming, traumatic for you later.
The idea too of picking your facility, I talk about that a lot. I don't know if you're familiar with leapfroggroup.org, but that's one that I always kind of recommend to my viewers to kind of look and see, we want to look and see what the cesarean rate is at that facility, what the episiotomy rate is at that facility, things of that nature. But also to kind of keep in mind too, sometimes you don't have a choice, right? Because maybe there's not more than one facility, but then also to the fact that sometimes you don't have a choice because part of your medical care, you need to be at a facility that has higher acuity.
That's right. That's right. So one of the things that I talk about a lot in my classes, as you know, is that there's this idea of like what the non-traumatic birth looks like. And I think we have to really correct this myth, because it's this idea that the non-traumatic birth is the low intervention birth. And the reason I want to correct that myth is because I think, number one, it discounts the experience of people who had a low intervention birth but still have trauma, because that happens. I see that in my office and in the support groups all the time. But also what it does is it sort of means, if you medically need support, if you medically need a NICU, if you medically need a planned cesarean, or if you just elect to have a planned cesarean, whatever your reasons are, it doesn't mean that you're set up for trauma. There's a really important interplay between what you expect and how it goes, the feelings of respect that you have. I have, as a doula, attended planned cesareans that were healing for trauma, because the person felt cared for, they felt heard, they felt respected in their wishes, they understood what was happening, and they got support for things that were important to them in that experience, like skin to skin and immediate breastfeeding. And so I think that it's so important when I do provider education, and even when I talk to people who are pregnant, like one of the things I want to say is, we don't have to have this like perfect ideal, in the water with beautiful music and dim lighting and everything is smooth and nobody has any concerns. We don't have to have that birth in order for it to be non-traumatic. Trauma is not about whether or not the birth was hard. Trauma is about how your central nervous system responds to it. So there are things that prime you for that reaction, and it's not about whether or not the birth was hard. We can have hard births and we can be resilient. We can say that birth was really difficult, but it doesn't continue to dog us and haunt us and bother us, right? There's different factors. There's a lot of different factors that go into that. But I like what you brought up, and I think it's really important to echo, which is that when you're choosing providers, when you're choosing location, I'm not just speaking to those who are hoping to have an unmedicated vaginal birth. I'm speaking to the whole spectrum of people giving birth. It's worth putting time and energy into these decisions, because this is the setup for how you become a parent to this child. And if that setup can be one that feels that you feel cared for, that you feel respected, that you feel heard, that you feel well communicated, that you feel empowered through the process, like what a great setup to the postpartum period, right? So whatever that is.
So can we talk about birth trauma in the time of COVID-19 and how COVID is maybe affecting that?
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously this is really recent and the literature is coming out quickly and we're still learning, and I'm updating my classes as the literature comes out. So what we know going into this is, almost 1/3 of people who are giving birth are coming away with trauma before this. I also know that certain characteristics of the birth or the birth environment increase the risk of trauma. And one of those is unpredictability. The more unpredictable your environment is, the more you can feel threatened and the more you can feel shock And both of those things create an environment for your central nervous system to be in fight or flight, which primes you for trauma, right? What also goes with that is fear of safety. Fear of safety also primes us for trauma. So when we put all of those things together, although I don't have the statistics right now on birth trauma specific to COVID, I expect it to be much higher. One of the things that we're seeing is the fear that there will be forcible separation between mother and infant. Luckily, just recently, the AAP came out recommending that mother and infant can stay together. I'm really thankful for that. The World Health Organization has always recommended that. I'm hoping the CDC will, robustly recommend that soon because they've been in alignment with the AAP. But the point is that whether or not your particular facility was ever going to do that, parents are going into the hospital thinking, what if I'm asymptomatic? What if I test positive? And what if they forcibly take my infant from me and isolate them and I can't see them? Because we're seeing stories like that all over the country. So even if it's not happening to that person directly, there's such a thing as vicarious trauma, which means if I'm afraid for my safety, my loved one's safety, my infant's safety, if I can't predict reasonably what's going to happen here, so I'm walking into the facility scared and on high alert, that is all a recipe to walk away with psychological trauma after the fact. Even if nobody ever took the infant away, you're still more likely to get trauma. So we already are seeing increase in postpartum anxiety and depression. So there's a lot of reason to, if you're watching this and you're either a provider or a professional or you're a doula or you're somebody in your life is about to have a baby or just had a baby, they need so much extra love right now. Like what they're facing, what they're experiencing is unprecedented. It's not even something we can coach them through because we've never done this. This is just unprecedented. So the more love, the more communication, the more clarity, the more predictability we can give them, the more we can help try to insulate them.
Okay, whew, that kind of made me emotional because it's so hard, and everybody's just trying to do the best that they can,
right?
With the information that we have, and unfortunately, that information is ever changing.
Ever changing, and policies and recommendations are ever changing.
If you've experienced something that feels traumatic to you, kind of right off the bat, if you're kind of recognizing that, what can you do to help yourself process that experience and make it not kind of be a traumatic experience long term?
Yeah, I love this question. So what we know, what we can guess from looking at the literature is that there is a window of plasticity. And what I mean by that is you can have an experience that has it checks every box in likely to be traumatic, but there's this window of time where your brain has not yet formed the memory long term. And so there's negotiation in there. There are things you can do when you come home to help yourself, right? So some of the things that I can tell you from my personal experience as a therapist or a doula, and then also I can tell you through the literature, I'm kind of blending them together because this is still an area that needs to be researched more in the prevention end. Things that we can do: talking to a trusted person about what happened, somebody who's going to listen, who's not going to judge, who's going to empathize. Because what your brain is trying to do is when you repeatedly tell the story, your brain is saying, I didn't get that the first time. That really overwhelmed me. Let me try again. Your brain's trying and trying and trying to make sense of what happened to it through that, right? So an empathetic listener can go a long way. Somebody who's not going to shame you or shut you down or give you the healthy baby line who tell you to get over it, but somebody who's going to listen, right? And so just that listening is super important. Another thing you can do is somewhere around the 2 to 6 week range, if you can get any questions answered. So if part of your experience is that you either didn't understand why it happened, you have questions about what was chosen in your care, you have holes in your memory, which is very common in some birth environments, getting those questions answered again can help, right? It depends, because the answer may or may not be something you want to hear, but at least at that point your brain will stop trying to fill in the hole, and then you can figure out what to do from there. Another thing is, if you're lucky enough to have connection with a mental health provider who is trained in techniques like EMDR or brain spotting or a similar technique, what we're seeing in research with trauma is we used to think you had to wait till the trauma was over and then get treatment. But actually what they're seeing now is in the first few weeks after a trauma, 1 or 2 sessions can make a huge difference. Huge exponential difference in that never goes on to become a traumatic memory. Your brain gets what it needs, your central nervous system gets what it needs, and it is able to put it back into the memory column of like normal memory. So things you can do for yourself, anything bilateral. So when you feel well enough, gentle walking. They actually have bilateral music online that you can listen to in headphones. And why? Because we know that this is part of how the brain processes memory. So it's part of REM sleep, which is in short supply in the early postpartum period. So if you can listen to music that's bilateral, if you can walk, if you can swim, when you're like able to do those things physically, it's not about exercise. We're not trying to work up a sweat. We're trying to give your body alternating feedback, because that's actually part right brain, left brain. That's part of how our brain processes experiences and memories. And finally, so if you don't have your own support, what we are seeing in research is that there is great value in writing. So even if you don't have that person who can listen to you right away, if you write it down as if you're speaking to a diary, and you pour all of your feelings into it, and you pour all of the experiences into it, even for 20 minutes, if you do that early postpartum, you're actually improving your brain's ability to process the experience. So if you're somebody who can't get that support system or doesn't have access to it, those are some things you can even just do for yourself.
How could family and friends support somebody who has gone through birth trauma, who clearly is struggling with the experience of what has just happened to them?
Yes. So, yes, empathetic listening is everything. Listen without fixing, right? Listen without redefining, listen without offering an alternative, listen without reassuring, listen without telling them, well, you all survived and you're fine. Don't put a timeline on how many times they need to tell the story. Don't put a timeline on how many times they need to be heard. That's really challenging to do. Listening without any fixing is the best thing that you can possibly do. There's one more thing that you can do that is undoubtedly very helpful. And also, I always cringe when I say it, because I'm like, I don't know if people are going to like me saying this. Sleep is so important to traumatic memory processing. That bilateral I talked about, REM sleep is doing that. And REM sleep is in very short supply for many after they have a baby, right? And so when somebody is really struggling with trauma, one of the ways you can actually help accelerate their healing process is to make sure that you're supporting them to at least get one stretch of uninterrupted sleep, just even a few hours, just one full cycle every night. That will help them immensely. Just to help their brain and their body get what they need, along with the fact that like their body is trying to heal, right? So I mean, just anyway, sleep is not going to hurt anybody, but it really helps with memory formation.
Well, I'm always a fan of sleep, so I appreciate that. And it's so hard to get in the beginning. And I
It
really
is so
like
hard.
that comment about listening without fixing.
Yeah.
I think that even as a nurse, I struggle with that. Like, we're just fixers. That's what we do.
Yeah.
And this is I think a lot of support people struggle with this in birth too. Like, they want to fix birth, but you can't fix birth. It's just something that's happening. These contractions are uncomfortable. You can't fix that, but you can just be there for them. Okay, well, those were all of my questions. I don't know if you had anything that you wanted to add.
Yeah, you know, one of the things that why I'm going around talking, about this subject is, number one, I want to help us figure out how to make it better. I'm a fixer, right? I'm doing that too. But the other reason that I want to go around and talk about it is because I believe that this is prevalent. We know it is now. 15 years ago when I started treating it, I suspected it was. Now we have the research to back up how prevalent this issue is. And what ends up happening is it's seen as weakness. It's seen as negativity. It's seen as lack of gratitude. And what people will say are things like, just be thankful you all made it out alive. Just be grateful you have a healthy baby. It could have been worse. Mine was worse. Mine was harder, and I'm fine. You should be fine. And so what ends up happening is, before people ever get in my office, number one, they don't realize they have trauma because it's not really talked about enough. As much as we still need to educate on perinatal anxiety and depression, we way need to educate on perinatal trauma. It's behind even that, just perinatal mental health in general. There's a lot of education to be done. So they're not being told that they have trauma until it's been years of suffering. Or by the time I see them, they feel this sense of shame, because the message they've received from well-intentioned people who are trying to fix or trying to make them feel better is that just be more grateful, right? Just pray about it, just feel optimistic about it, just whatever, just fill in the blank, and you'll be fine. I was fine, you'll be fine, we'll be fine. And so what I want to say to people right now, what is so important to me to say, is that trauma is not a failure of optimism. Trauma is not a failure of your strength. Trauma does not mean you don't love your baby. Trauma does not mean that you need to be more grateful. Trauma is a central nervous system response. If you think about it like a padlock, it went click, 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 and your central nervous system had the response that it could have. It had the response that it knew to have, and it's trying to protect you. It's your brain trying to protect you. It's misguided. It doesn't know it's not helping, but it's trying really hard. And so it's a central nervous system response. It's not a failure. You can be optimistic and have trauma. You can be strong and have trauma. You can love your baby and have trauma. You can be grateful and have trauma, because it's a central nervous system response. And so I want to let people know it's highly treatable and it's not your fault, so that people will not hesitate to get help because of shame. People will ask the next doctor if the first one doesn't give them a satisfactory response, because I want to see people set up to thrive in their postpartum period as they make a family with their baby. Being in PTSD while you're trying to make a family with your baby is really, really awful. And it doesn't have to be that way, because it's highly treatable. So that's what I want people to know.
So if we have people who feel like they have experienced birth trauma and are watching this video, what are some resources that you can kind of guide them to? How could they find a provider who knows how to treat this, right? Because it's not going to be every provider. It's not going to be every therapist.
No, it's not. And that's unfortunate. So if you go to a provider or a mental health provider and they give you any of those lines about be grateful, be optimistic, at least you made it out alive, leave, don't come back. They don't get it. They don't know the research. They're working on old school functioning of trauma. They don't understand the newest research in the last decade or two of trauma. So it's not you, it's them. Find somebody who can help you. I've actually started to create a referral network, and I'm hoping by the end of this year, my goal is that we will have maybe 300 to 500 professionals on it. Right now we have maybe getting close to 2. And that is on birthandtraumasupportcenter.org/referral, or you can just go to birthandtraumasupportcenter.org and find the referral tab there. And even if it's not the provider you're looking for, like maybe you're looking for a midwife, but then in that area there's a therapist, you could call them and ask them, because they tend to know each other. Are there any trauma-informed providers in this area? So there's mental health providers there. If that doesn't help you, if you can't find them there, my recommendation is, according to the literature, what we know to be highly effective is EMDR. And that stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And the reason I like it for the postpartum period is because it's rapid. And when you're going home every day to a newborn, a week between sessions is a lifetime, right? We can't spend a year in therapy waiting, hoping that symptoms will get better. When we have trauma and we have a newborn, we need to feel relief as quickly as we can. So I love EMDR for that. So if you can't find anybody on my referral list, go look for somebody in your area who does EMDR, or somebody who does virtual support for that. There's also a close complement called brain spotting that I do. If you can't find that, look for somebody who does perhaps like somatic experiencing or some other body-based modality. Reason being, that's the fastest. That's the fastest route to reducing some of those symptoms. And when you're experiencing trauma, even 50% improvement is like a world of difference. Like you can catch your breath, you can function again. So the quicker we can get there, the better.
Awesome. Okay. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you. It was awesome.